Today, we'll be looking at how to compare two or more lists in Excel. We'll be comparing the lists to look for commonalities or matches across them, and we'll be looking for any differences. In this example, let's pretend that we work for a company and each week HR sends an updated employee roster. HR would like us to run an analysis comparing each week's roster to the last, to look for employees that have been added or employees that have been removed. In this example, just to make it a little bit more complicated, let's pretend we're a little bit behind, so we need to compare the last 3 weeks to one another. As always, if you'd like to follow along with this example, hit the link in the description to download a copy of the example file we'll be walking through here. In this file, we have 3 tabs. Each one represents an employee roster from a particular week. For the latest, we have a roster from May 15th, another from May 8th, and another from May 1st. When faced with this situation, a lot of people will be tempted to use a VLOOKUP or a match formula. For example, if we go to the most current roster, we can add a column here that says match and do a quick match formula. We'll be looking for that employee ID on the previous week's roster. And we can copy that all the way down and see where we have a match, where we see a number, that means the employee was present on the previous week. Where we get an NA, that would tell us the employee is new. Now, this method does work. However, it gets more complicated once you get to comparing more than 2 lists. And even with 2 lists, it can get confusing because we'll have to do the match formula on the current roster to check who has been added. Then we'll have to go back to the previous roster, do a match formula there to see who was removed. And you can very easily get confused trying to remember, wait a minute, does this NA mean the employee was added or does it mean they were removed? It basically turns this whole thing into a brain teaser, especially when you're dealing with more than just 2 lists like we're dealing with here. So I'll show you my preferred method that I think is a little bit more efficient and a lot less confusing. The first step of this process is taking each of your lists and combining them into one big data set. However, when we combine them, we want to make sure that if we look at a particular record, a particular line item on that list, we know which list it came from. So let's go into each of these rosters and add a new column that labels which version of the list each record is coming from. In this example, when we say which version of the list, we're essentially talking about which roster. So on the May 1st roster, I'm going to add a version column and just write May 1st. Copy that all the way down. I'm going to repeat that process for each of these other tabs. And usually when I add a column to raw data, I like to highlight that column. So if we go back to this in the future, we'll know that column B onward, that was the original raw data that was provided to us, and the version column is something new that we added. So now on each of the roster tabs, we have a new column which labels each record indicating which version of the roster that record came from. And you can customize this column so it makes sense for your situation. For example, if you are dealing with just 2 lists, you could label one list as old and one list as new. So when you combine them, you can see which records came from the old list and which records came from the new list. Now that we've got our new columns added, let's go ahead and combine these lists onto one tab. I'm going to create a new tab called Combined, and I'm going to copy the roster from May 1st onto this new tab, and I'm going to make sure to paste values. In this case, we don't have any formulas, but it is possible that the data you're dealing with will have formulas, and you won't want to carry those over because you could break them or they might not work when they're pasted on this new tab. So I just pasted values and then I pasted formats just because I want this to look nice. And when you copy the second one, you don't need to copy that header again because we already have it from the first roster. And now let's copy the third roster. Now we have all three rosters combined onto one big data set. If I scroll down, you'll see we have the May 1st roster, the May 8th roster, and finally the May 15th roster. That means that some employees will be on this list multiple times if they were present across multiple iterations of the roster. The next thing we're going to do is create a pivot table off of this data set. So I'm going to select all of the data in this new combined data set and then insert a pivot table. So we'll do that on a new worksheet. And once we've got this new pivot table set up, here's how we're going to set up the rows and columns. We want employee ID, first name, and last name to be your rows. Then we'll want version to be the column. And I'm also going to take version and put it in values. Now, because version is just a date, if you remember, the version column is where we put the roster date, rather than a sum in our pivot, we're going to get a count. And that's exactly what we want. Now we just need to get this table formatted in a way that it's useful for us. So hit the Design tab on the ribbon, then turn off subtotals, turn off grand totals, and under Report Layout, click Show in Tabular Form. So you can probably already see where we're going with this. The table has been set up in such a way that every single employee is listed, and going from left to right, we get an indication of which rosters that employee was present for. So for example, we can see here Rebecca Allen was on the May 1st roster, she was on the May 8th roster, but she's not on the May 15th roster. The reason this works is because when we combined all of the rosters onto one tab, as I mentioned earlier, an employee will show up multiple times in that combined data set if they were present on multiple rosters. However, for each of the records where that employee shows up, that record will look unique because it's labeled with a date, the date indicating which roster that record came from. Let's look at Rebecca Allen as an example. If we go to the Combined tab and I throw a filter on this list, then I filter to Rebecca Allen, we can see that Rebecca is on here twice. One for her May 1st record and one for her May 8th record. On the pivot table, we're using the count function to summarize. An employee should only be on a roster once, which means when we're looking at employee counts, we should see either a 1 if they were present on that roster or a blank if they weren't present. So very easily we can see Rebecca was here for May 1st, May 8th, and is not here for May 15th. So we're almost there, but let's do a little bit of cleanup so we can make a good, clean report out from this analysis. First, right-click on the pivot table, then hit Pivot Table Options, and next to For Empty Cells Show, instead of showing a blank, let's tell it to show us a 0. Now, we're going to copy the data from this pivot table and paste it somewhere else so we have the data in a raw format in a way that's easier for us to work with and do whatever we want with it. You might have this blank column here. You can just ignore that. So I'm going to copy all the way down. I also have a blank row over here. I'm going to ignore that and then copy this and paste it to a new tab. Right now, it works, right? We can scroll down and see employees that have been removed. We can see employees that have been added. Honey Nelson, for example, was not here for a couple of weeks, and then Honey showed up on May 15th. But we have to scroll all the way through to find these employees that had some kind of a change in their status. Let's sort this data so we can get all of the employees that have had some sort of a change, get all those employees right next to each other so we can quickly see the important results of this analysis. So I'm going to select all the data and I'm going to add a sort. And I'm going to do that by either using the shortcut key, Alt-DS, or by clicking on the Data tab and hitting Sort. So what we want to do here is, for the first column, select our rightmost version column. Then we want to select, moving from right to left, the next one, and finally the oldest column. And for each of these, we want to sort smallest to largest. then hit OK. What that's done is it's sorted our list so that any employees that have experienced some sort of a change have been clustered at the top of the spreadsheet. So right off the bat, we can see we had 4 employees that were present May 1st and May 8th, and then were removed on May 15th. We can see we have 10 employees that were just added on May 15th. You can see from the zeros, they weren't here on the May 1st roster or the May 8th roster. And then finally, we can see a couple of employees that were added May 8th. They weren't here on the May 1st roster, but they were there on the May 8th roster. So that about covers it. I'm a big fan of this approach because you get a good, clean report out at the end of the process. You don't have to mess around with lookups or match formulas, so you don't risk getting confused over what an NA actually means. And this works for any number of lists. In this example, we looked at comparing 3 lists, but it would work just fine with 5 or 6 lists. You can also imagine how this would be useful for more than just telling if somebody was added or removed from a list. You could also use this for more complex scenarios. For example, imagine if you had a product listing and each product had a specific price. Let's say that you get a product sheet and then you get a new version of that product sheet, and at the bottom you see that your total cost has changed, but you're not sure why it changed. Is it because you added more products to the list? Is it because a couple of products had their price changed? You could use this exact same method to compare the old product list to the new one, but instead of using the count function on your pivot table, you could use the sum function. And that would tell you if the total cost of a product has changed from one version to the next. Anyway, if you're new to the world of Excel or the world of finance, you will be amazed at how often you need to compare lists to each other. So make sure to keep this method in your back pocket, and you will become a great asset for people in your office. You'll be the guy or gal that everybody comes to when they need to compare lists. Anyway, I hope this was helpful for you. Make sure to leave a note in the comments if you have any questions or would like to see me expand on anything I talked about in this video. But otherwise, if you enjoyed this and you found it helpful, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell icon so you get notified the next time we release a video. Thanks for watching.